The title of today's presentation is Understanding is Being Able to Teach, Interteaching as Collaborative Active Learning Strategy in Hybrid and Online Courses. Dr. Andrés Garcia Penagos is in the psychology department. Go ahead and hand it over to Andrés.
And the reason why I've been thinking of doing this talk is because of how wonderful this strategy has been to me over the years, but particularly in the last few months with the pandemics and everything, to get my students engaged, to get them to learn, and to get them to discuss. And those are topics that we don't often see when teaching online. I think that I speak for myself. I've felt a lot of frustration with the online teaching, with the online delivery. Frustration with the way we put our discussion questions, with the level of engagement that we get. Also, because most of us are teaching hybrid, because it provided also a kind of an easy leeway into the more active learning components that we do in hybrid classes when we meet face to face. So I'm going to share what I've learned. A lot of what I will be presenting today about this method is something that I'm working on right now and I'm refining as it is right now, which is one of the good things about this method, that is very flexible, very adaptable. But it also means that a lot of my insights depend on just my anecdotes and don't rely as much on more objective measures. Nonetheless, hopefully we'll get to discuss a little bit of the research about this. So interteaching is a horrible name for a practice, for an educational practice that was developed about 20 years ago. It was developed by a couple of people in an area in psychology that is called the analysis of behavior, experimental analysis of behavior. Those of you who are familiar with psychology might remember the name B.F. Skinner. These are students of B.F. Skinner who have tried to come up with different ways to teach other than the lecture. And this is an important aspect of this. Skinner didn't like lecturing that much. He was all for individual practice, and he was for measuring objectives and delivering immediate consequences. There is plenty to say about his methods and everything, but his students, in this case Philip Heinlein in 2002, tried to come up with a kind of a modification of those early ideas to essentially enhance student engagement, to reduce the amount of lecturing, but also keeping or at least restoring some of those elements that have been useful in other classes, of course. This is how they defined interteaching in 2002, a mutually probing, mutually informing conversation between two people. It lasts 30 to 40 minutes and deals with the main topics in a specified selection of material, textbook or articles. So essentially what this is a simple collaborative learning exercise, a model based on collaborative learning. So in that respect, it's not very different from other strategies that involve, collaborative learning, but it has some specificities that are very unique to this method and that I will be explaining in more detail next. So essentially, the way interteaching works is the following. Every week, or depending on the course, the faculty will develop a preparation guide or a prep guide based on the course material that students are supposed to read or watch the following week for the following module or so. So this preparation guide essentially contains a bunch of questions. I'll talk about those questions in more detail in a moment, but they are generally questions that go from the very simple to what is the definition of so and so, to higher level critical thinking questions where we ask students to find examples, to compare topics, to find exceptions, and those type of things. In any case, the students will read and will complete these preparation guides before a class session. And by the way, this was developed for just face-to-face classes originally 20 years ago. So students complete the preparation guide before the class sessions, and when they meet during class time, the point is that they will be split into groups, small groups. In Boyce and Heinlein's original formulation, they suggested pairs or at most 3 students. And then students essentially teach each other, hence the name interteaching. So they discuss the guide in small groups. As I said, groups generally pairs or triads during class. They go over all of the topics of the guide. And then at the time when that is going on, the instructor essentially starts monitoring and facilitating the discussion by walking through the groups, asking questions back and forth, solving answers, getting feedback, trying to see if students are understanding or not. Following that, students, when they finish their session, they complete a record of the session where they essentially describe what topics were important, what topics they would like to hear more about, what topics were unclear, what questions were difficult, and those type of questions. Based upon those records, the faculty uses those to determine what needs further explanation, and then the faculty develops a mini lecture answering just those questions or emphasizing points that, according to the meeting and the discussions, were particularly important. So as you can see, and again, please feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. Essentially, what we're doing is just guiding the reading, but also asking them to interact with each other, to engage in a constructive discussion and intellectually illuminating discussion, and then developing a lecture or a mini lecture based upon those topics that are not as clear. And the cycle essentially repeats. So to summarize it and to put it on both sides, from the faculty side, this is how it happens. So the faculty develops the study materials, the preparation guides, of course, the readings and those type of things. During the interteach, the faculty facilitates the exercise by going group to group, talking, asking questions, discussing, elaborating, engaging the students directly. Then, at the end of the session, the students complete this record log, this session log, and then the instructor evaluates these, reads these questions, tries to determine out of these what are important topics, what are important issues to elaborate upon, what are activities, what are things that require better explanations, generate a lecture or some sort of material to expand upon this and to collaborate with this, and then assess the learning of students by way of quizzes and the like, and the cycle continues. From the student side, the way it works is this: is essentially the student reads the assigned test, the preparation guide, completes it, reads the text, of course, and then the preparation guide, completes it, then go to the session where they discuss, interteach, teach each other, complete the session log, and complete their assessment, quiz, exam, or so on. An important point of this, as I said, is double. One of them, this is not only just a guided reading. It is not just about the students reading. That is a very important part of this, getting our students to read. But also, it is important for Interteach to get the students involved in this process of exchanging ideas, exchanging answers, comparing their answers, discussing, going further in detail. The logic and the educational principle that underlies this, and this is one that I subscribe to, is that understanding something, really understanding something, means more than anything being able to explain it to someone else. So the type of exercise that I require my students to do, although that is of course not always the case, but I always ask them to think about their peers, about their peers in the classroom as a person who has no idea, and I ask them to imagine that they are talking to a 5-year-old, or that they are talking to their grandmas or grandpas, or someone that is not familiar with the field that they're going. And I want them to be able to explain without looking at their answers. Of course, the students come to class with their answers printed quite often or in their computers. And they, and this is one of the difficulties with this, they tend to just go over what they wrote and leave it at that. The type of exercise that we want during interteaching is more specific, because what we want, as I will mention in a moment, is for them to actually start a conversation. That is the important point. Not just reading, but start an engaging conversation with their classmates. where they can question their answers, where they can think of different examples, where they can compare and contrast their views, where they can engage more directly into the material. So again, the underlying logic, at least the way I see it, is that they are able to learn by teaching others. So let me talk before we talk a little bit about how I have been using and others have been using this strategy in hybrid or online classes. Talk about some of the best practices in research.
Okay.
So Valerie is asking, does the lecture based on the completed session log happen during the current class session or during a future session? You can do it either way. For instance, I'm not teaching, I'm not doing Interteach Monday, Wednesday, Friday this semester. But what I plan to do for the spring is my students have the Interteach sessions either Monday or Wednesday, and then on Friday, I devote the whole Friday to do the mini lecture. When it is a Tuesday, Thursday, rather what I do is I finish the Interteach part a little bit earlier, and I use the remainder of the class to answer at least some of those questions. And because of the pandemics and those type of things, what I've done more often is I post my mini lecture later in the day or the next day as a small video or something like that. So it really is very flexible. You can do it either way. It's an issue of how much time you have, how much it takes your students to complete it, or how difficult some topics. Quite often what ends up happening in my classes is that my students are so engaged in the discussion that we only have like 5 minutes to complete. So that doesn't give me enough time to lecture during the session. But again, it depends on your goals, depends on your questions, depends on how much it takes the students to complete it. Quite a few articles are published every year. And some of this research has suggested some modifications and some varieties of these. By the way, and I'm sorry for the advertisement, I'm very interested in doing research on this, on aspect of this. So if any of you are interested in doing some educational research on comparing these across sections of a class or something like that, I would be more than happy. Please contact me and we can talk and start doing research on this. So what you see here in my slide is an example of a preparation guide. This is not mine. This is taken from someone else, but I wanted to show you, and I'll show you some of mine in a moment. So as you can see, these are questions, really simple questions. Some of them are very to the point. What is the definition of these? Others as, explain the role of so and so in your own words, define what is this, what is that, provide your own example of this or that, right? So the idea again is to have questions that help students engaging in a conversation, rather than questions that they just can answer with a yes or no, or with a simple definition that they just copy and paste. Notice, for instance, in this example here, that they ask, how could you use, what are disadvantages and advantages, those type of questions. In regards to the best practices about this, about the preparatory guide or the preparation guide, the way the original authors suggested was to leave it or to keep it at about 10 to 12 questions approximately. That should be enough for a session. This is all flexible. For my online classes, I generally am very flexible with this. But for a typical session, you have about 10 or 12 questions. And they also recommend, and most research tends to suggest that it should cover about 10 to 15 pages of material. That is generally about half of a textbook chapter or so. The idea is that, of course, that they can read it in detail, that they can read it, engage critically with the material and those type of things. As I said, the questions tend to range, and that is the recommendation, from the very simple definitional to the more complex. I know that Bloom's taxonomy is a controversial topic for some, but this fits very well with this idea, right? That we have questions that range just from the memory part and the conceptual part to the more logical and more complicated, higher learning level of activities. The idea, again, with this is that we do it incrementally, right? So at the beginning in the guide, we'll have kind of the simple questions, the more definitional type, and then the further questions along the guide start increasing in their complexity or engaging more in abstract thinking, critical thinking, and those type of things. The questions, of course, depend on your learning objectives for the module, right? Depend on how appropriate or relevant you think they are. You don't have to ask a question about every single aspect of your readings. You don't have to talk about every single section in a chapter. It depends on what you really want them to teach. So this ties in very well, or at least should tie in very well with our learning goals for each of this session. It's a very thoughtful way of engaging in this way, right? Such that they articulate well with what you really want them to learn. So it is also an exercise, and I talk about from experience here, right? That when you're designing a guide for a material and you have only 10 or 12 questions, you have to start figuring out what is fundamental for my students to learn, right? What do I really want them to learn? And what material is not as important, is not as necessary, is not as fundamental, which I think, at least in my own case, has provided with a much more insightful and much more goal-oriented approach to the materials that I want my students to engage in. Of course, another issue regarding the guide has to do with how much time it takes for students to discuss, uh, how much time they're going to spend in this, and so on. So all of those are questions that are important when doing this. Finally, and generally, a recommendation is that you send this guide a few days in advance. The traditional way, and that's what I tend to do, is send them at least 1 week in advance. Of course, when you're developing this, it is a little bit complicated. It's a lot of work when you first start doing this, because you have to go through a reading and again decide, come up with questions, and so on and so on. But once you do it, for the next time that you teach the same class, or at least that's the idea, it will be easier because you already have developed this material and you just need to refine a few questions here and there based on their feedback. In any case, the idea is that they have plenty of time to complete this. Of course, the students, vary on this. Some complete the guide right the same day. Some others complete it only half an hour before the session. So it really depends. But in general, the idea is that they have plenty of time to read, because again, most of these questions require critical thinking and planning and those type of things. Other issues that are important here have to do with how credit works and how is credit assigned for this. There's a lot of flexibility on this and a lot of different variants. Different instructors using this method use it in different ways. The way the authors originally developed it was that there were no points for just participating in the discussions or anything like that. Students just had to complete their guides on their own and essentially go and attend the meeting, and that would be it. Of course, part of the issue is, what if they don't read? What if they don't complete the guide and those type of things? The way the original authors developed this was by making use of a powerful motivator in human behavior, that is shame. So the idea here is that if you're unprepared and if you have not done your reading and the like, when you go to work in a group, your partner is going to notice that you have no idea, and that will be embarrassing, and that you will be punished by doing so. Hence, in the future, you will stop doing it. The original authors, as I said, originally thought that that would be kind of enough. Of course, ever since, people have used different variations. Some people require that the guidelines, that the prep guides are submitted in advance. Some others collect points for them, turning them in at the beginning of the class. There are all sort of varieties for this. In any case, the recommendation is that it's done in small groups. Originally, the authors thought about just two pairs, just pairs, that is just two students, or at most groups of 3 or 4, depending on the size of your class. For really large classes, you could use about 4 or so, at least in the original idea. Another important aspect of interteaching has to do with the fact that they ideally should be paired randomly with different classmates every time. And this is also an aspect that I really like about this, and that I find very important, because you probably all have experienced how our students, they always talk with the same type of people, right? They always get with their friend, and that's it. Of course, people varying how much they enforce this, but the best way of doing this is by randomly assign someone every class, or by if you don't feel like enforcing this, to invite them to find and choose someone that they have not worked with before. And this aspect is a very important one. This aspect of getting to know all of different students, getting to know each other very well, getting to hear their ideas and the like. Again, this is just anecdotal, but in my classes, what I've noticed is that after doing a few sessions of these, you get this great atmosphere in the classroom because people, they all know each other, they all know their work, they all participate, they start talking to each other. So I think that is a very important one. Jumping a little bit ahead to the issue of teaching online. Again, you might know that one of the problems that we have with the students who are taking our classes only online is the lack of student engagement, and of course student instructor engagement. So interteaching also allows, at least to some extent, those students who are connected only via Zoom to talk and interact with some of their classmates, which might be in the classroom or who might be online as well. So it also has this social function that I think is very important to our courses. And I think that is one of the parts that my students, at least so far, seem to be enjoying the most. Also, by randomly pairing students, by changing who they are paired with every week, it also prevents that the students who are not very well prepared work together all the time, which might be a big problem, right? If you always have a couple of students who never complete their work very well and they are always working together, there is no motivation to do better. So rotating the pairs every week also tends to help a little bit with this. As I said, ultimately, and this is what I have observed in my own class, but research has also suggested, we get this collectivistic learning environment where students become really free to share their opinions, to share their thoughts about the material. They feel less scared about sharing their opinion, and they also feel more willing to participate, to talk, and to be heard. They have some more control over their learning, and this is an important part of this methodology, as are almost all of the active learning activities, right? That the emphasis or the control is to some extent in the student, and the student goes at his or her own pace as they go with the reading, as they go with the material, as they engage with the material, and also as they discuss. So all of these are important points here. Yes, April. So April is asking me about asynchronous online. I'll mention what I have for asynchronous at the end, because that is what I'm doing right now. Let me finish by saying that the original authors, at least in this aspect, in this part, the creators of this strategy suggested that to increase engagement and to increase participation in the discussions, quality points should be given. What this meant is that there will be, in their quizzes or in their exams, in their tests, there will be at least sometimes a question that is directly taken from the preparation guide. And if both of the students in the pair got that answer correctly, they would get an extra point for that. That's what the quality points mean. So essentially, it is rewarding students who engage in the discussion and who collaborated and who helped each other learn in this. So that has been recommended. Unfortunately, the research on this is not very solid. What they have suggested, what most of the research on this has suggested, is that these quality points make a little to no difference. Although, of course, there are comments about how specific you give these quality points, which might be an important point in this. What about the role of the instructor? Well, again, as I said, the important part for the instructor is that you're not just a passive bystander. You're not just there letting them do their discussion, but you're going from group to group to observe how they talk, to see how deeply they're engaging material with the questions, how fast they are going. So quite often when I go and check my students, they are already in the last two questions, right? And I say, well, wait a minute, what about these other questions? What did you have for this? So this also increases, and this is another aspect about this method that I really like a lot, our ability to engage directly with our students, to give immediate feedback, to hear them, to understand what they are saying, to check them. Of course, at the beginning, they feel embarrassed, for instance, when they don't have a question, when they don't have the answer and those type of things, and you can see them fumbling. But after a while, when you keep doing this, your students get used to getting answers, to getting questions directly, asked directly, and to share their answers, and to engage more, and to find examples of their own. It also gives me, at least, the chance to quite often say to my students, correct, that is fantastic, that is a fantastic example. And something that I seldom get to do when I just lecture, because unless in a lecture you interrupt your lecture and ask a question, there are not a lot of chances to do so. It provides a lot of instances, moments where you can go directly and engage directly with your students. But Valerie is asking, is saying that it's interesting that the quality points weren't found to be effective, and indeed, that is the case. Now, what have been suggested as a reason why they don't seem to work that much, some people have suggested that it happens because these exam questions might occur after a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the exercise, that they probably are not relevant anymore, or that they are not enough motivation for them to do them. But more specifically, the studies that have checked this have mostly evaluated tests that use multiple choice questions. And as much as multiple choice questions, and you all know this, save us a lot of time, they might not be the best way to address or to get higher levels of thinking. So some people have been suggesting that probably the reason why there is not such effect of quality points in this is that it is not as evident unless you use essay questions, and in essay questions you might see more of a difference. Again, this is a matter that has yet to be researched in more detail, but it's still, yes, interesting, very interesting. Going back to the issue of the structure, right? So you provide clarification, you ask questions, you integrate, you engage, you can ask, why did you say so? What did the others of you think? And those type of things. So you can always reframe their inaccurate answers, redirect, tell them, okay, read this very well, or read this other thing. What do you think about this? That's interesting. Those type of things, which are very important here. Also, of course, the instructor has, and quite often does, notice problems. Let's say there's a question that every group seems to be having a lot of issues with, a question that none of the groups seem to be able to have a good answer for. So quite often, I and of course other people doing this do this, will interrupt the whole session and say, "Hey, let's stop for a second. I noticed this question," and right. So you do a little lecture in there, a little clarification in there, right? Or in any case, you keep your ears and your eyes open to see what you need to put in your subsequent clarifying lecture. And of course, and this is up to you, in that end of the session record that I mentioned, students also get a chance to evaluate, the quality of the instructor's guidance. I might show you an example or so later, but sometimes my students say, you ask them at the end of the record, how do you like the exercise? How was it today? And many of them say, this was a really good exercise. All of my questions, all of my answers were clear. I had no idea. I didn't understand a few things, but then when we went over these, I really got them and those type of things. So again, the important point is that the instructor is really very active on this. And that is an important part of the exercise. Other small things before we talk a little bit about how we can apply these to more online and some of the limitations of this method have to do with the session duration. As I said, it really depends on your goals. Ideally, it should take about 2/3 of your class, right? So for a 50-minute period, that would be about, half an hour, 35 minutes, right? So there are about 15 minutes or so between your introduction and maybe your final notes or your, mini explanations and the like. What happens if the students finish too quickly, as happens sometimes? Well, that might mean two different things. One of them is that the students are just reading their answers and are not engaging in a conversation. To prevent this, of course, the only thing that you can do is to go ahead and talk to each of the groups and ask them to engage. Quite often, when they finish that quickly, that means that their answers are probably not very good, are very incomplete or that they don't even understand them, right? One of the things that I do when I teach, when I do the interteach is my students, I go to a group and tell them, what was your answer? And then of course they read it and I say, okay, so what does that mean? And quite often they are, at least at the beginning, a little bit, dumbfounded. They're like, they don't know what they mean, right? They just wrote whatever they found in the book or so, and didn't engage with this quickly. So again, the important role of this structure, asking further questions, asking for explanations, and the like, hopefully will prevent this. Also, of course, if your students keep finishing too quickly, that also might mean that your questions are probably not enough of a prompt for a conversation. That is, maybe they are way too specific, way to the point, such that they don't allow a conversation. So that also might be an indication that you need to reformulate your questions such that they engage, that they lead to a better discussion. Hence why I often like questions asking about personal examples and the like. I think those generally lend themselves as well to engage students in a conversation and also allow them to understand some of these concepts better. Another reason why students might finish earlier, and this quite often happens, is your really smart students, because your really smart students are so well prepared that they generally go right at it and finish very early. So it is always a good suggestion, a good piece of advice, that you have a few couple questions ready for credit that you ask during the session, or that you just present at the beginning of the session, or just keep with you, and you give them extra credit, which also rewards them for being so prepared, so well prepared for this. I have not done this. I always have a few extra questions, but I have not given them extra reward for this. That might be also an interesting thing to do. All of this sounds good, of course, but the important point is, how does the evidence for this work? Well, as I said, there's a lot of research, not as much, but there is a lot of research already building up on this, and many people have started to use this in different ways. One of the problems with the research is that, as I said, the way Interteach works is very adaptable. It's very flexible. That is, different instructors use them to different degrees and modify different aspects of it, although some of the basic aspects remain, kind of a family resemblance, a la Wittgenstein's, right? What I mean by this is, of course, that some instructors have the whole class is solely based on Interteach. Some other instructors have it like a weekly basis. Maybe one day they lecture, the other they have the Interteach. Some others only have 2 or 3 or 4 Interteach sessions throughout the semester. And again, all of these makes comparisons a little bit difficult, unless you purposefully, design a study where you have a section with one type and the other. In any case, that flexibility, notwithstanding, has allowed us to do some research on this. And as I show you here, generally this research has shown that compared to lecture-based or more traditional teaching methods, students in the Interteach sections tend to have higher quiz scores, tend to have higher course grades. And in general, when you ask them about their preference, they overwhelmingly prefer Interteach to lecture-based. Okay? Going back to one of the questions that April had before, indeed, some students resent this. The reason why they resent this is multiple. One of them is that students don't like to read. And you probably know this already. I was telling this to one of my colleagues, to John Westfall, last semester or so. This was before the pandemics. I was in a class. This is a very biologically based class here in psychology, sensation and perception. So students need to learn a lot about, physiology and the like. And my students often struggle a lot with that class. In any case, as I was, preparing for my class and everything, my students in the classroom started to talk to each other and, as usual, rant about their classes and the like. And one of my students said, her classmate, this is the only class that I have to read for, as if that was a thing. And you know it, right? The students don't like to read. Probably the aspect, and I probably should have added a slide on this, probably the aspect of the Interteach that seems to be the most effective in terms of long-term learning and retention has to do with the fact that students have to read the material, read it well, because otherwise they won't be able to complete their guides. And that is, again, a two-edged sword, because that also means that students who are not used to read and would rather just go and sit and take notes and then take their test with this will resent it. Unfortunately, I think there is not much that we can do about this aspect, right? Ultimately, some, and this is true of course of every educational method, some people are going to love it and some people are going to hate it. Some people do better in a lecture based style. Nonetheless, to help at least reduce some of this frustration with the teaching themselves and stuff, has to do with the active role of the instructor going group to group and engaging them directly. So the point is that the students notice and realize that it's not just sharing their answers, right? There is not just they telling each other what they found, but that the instructor is providing feedback and engaging and asking further questions that seems to be of more importance. Also, of course, the issue that you have to develop, or that you should develop when possible, an extra lecture or so, might help students getting a little bit of resistance to this method. Nonetheless, as I said, there are some students that for sure are going to dislike it. Again, there are many ways that you can evaluate this. In that end of the session record, particularly if you set it up as to be anonymous, you can ask your students, what did you like about this? What did you not like? What did you feel about the participants' experience or no, and so on. And hopefully, at least some of that feedback that you get at the end of the session can help you modifying whatever you need in your strategy to get those issues fixed. Valerie is saying students don't always know what is best for their learning, but active learning research is really robust, and this seems like a great way to learn actively if you can get a student buy-in. To buy in, indeed, I completely agree. I completely agree, Valerie. Of course, it's not perfect, as no method is, right? There are some issues, for instance, and if you don't mind, that my students quite often tend to get together and answer, put a shared docs, shared Google Docs, and then some people fill in their answers and some others just copy and paste, right? I have, of course, some that means that as a instructor you have to be very careful and keep reading their answers and those type of things just to make sure that they don't have the same answer, and also maybe some contingency like reducing points for verbatim quotes or just copy and paste, but also generally to provide some sort of questions that emphasize like personal examples and the like might get might reduce at least to some extent those. Do they know the groups in advance? It depends on how you set it up. Generally, the way I did it before pandemics is I just had a deck of cards, sorted one at the beginning of the class, and they had to find the matching. So that was completely random. They had no idea. And that is better when they don't know. Now that I use it in hybrid, generally I use breakout rooms for those students who are taking it online. And then, breakout rooms also put them randomly. You could technically, and in fact, some people do tell them in advance, like, next week you're going to work with these people or that people. I think that's not a problem. For instance, when you're teaching this at a master's level or a doctoral level, where your students, are much more responsible, I guess, at least to some extent. But in undergrad classes, it's better if they don't. Mostly just to promote this issue of getting to know a different person and so on. But yeah, so it really, you can do it either way. Also, in addition to increase performance in quizzes and tests, some other research, and this is relatively recent, 2015, found that they did better in most other aspects of a class, in the quality of their homework, in how much they participated, in their final exam scores, and so on. So again, good research. Of course, there is some research, I probably should have included a link to this. There's a couple of studies that have found no difference between lecture and Interteach, but no difference is also not that bad. That means that it's not worse to lecture. In general, bulk of the research, again, this is a topic that is still being studied, tends to suggest that it is more effective than traditional lecturing methods, and that the students tend to love it, at least to like it more. Again, probably because they can go at their own pace with these, they can devote more time to the topics that they find interesting and the like. And also, they love the interaction, at least some do, the interaction with others. Some students who don't like a lot talking to others might be less happy with that sometimes, But in general, as long as they are doing the reading and completed the reading, it seems that is also helpful for them, even when their classmates are, of course, not that well prepared. Of course, one of the problems here is that sometimes the students will be paired with someone who is not as well prepared. That is a problem, and that is unfortunate. It's very hard to avoid. Every now and then a student doesn't complete this. Generally, what I do is I ask my students at the beginning of the class to tell me in advance if they did not read. And then I pair them, I put them with a pair of other students who did read, such that this is not just one person doing all the talking and the other not. This is also something that you can evaluate by asking at the end of the session in the record log how well prepared they were at the beginning, and also how well prepared were their classmates. And this again, works quite well. Shame can be a powerful motivator sometimes. Another one that has not been as explored as it should, and probably is a good field to do research upon, has to do with critical thinking. And of course, the problem with this is how you measure critical thinking, right? But still, in many of these studies, and particularly this one by Goto and Schneider, students have found that engaging in their teachings increase their critical thinking, and probably has to do with the fact that they have to engage with these critical thinking questions. So again, a really good strategy, a really useful strategy. It has also been found out to be useful in a variety of disciplines. It's not only psychology. There are groups doing interteaching in computer science, mechanical engineering, medicine, biology, and some others. And it's really easy to adapt to any really discipline. Has been used in both small and large classes, and found to be effective in either type in a variety of universities, from the small to the private, from the liberal to the state, and so on. So let me finish. I don't know how we're doing on time, by saying that the study of how Interteach works in online courses is a relatively recent topic. It has only been used for a couple of studies, but of course, with the Interteach, I will not be surprised when I see more, because a lot of people are trying to implement this in these times. As you can see, this is an example of this. This is 2020. And as you can see, in this case, they actually tested with a couple of online asynchronous classes. You can do it in a number of ways. One way that you can set it up is that students, and this is how they did it in this, essentially had to, once they knew who was their pair, the students had to contact the instructor, and the instructor would set up a Zoom group, and then they met like in a regular Interteach meeting, but only in Zoom. I have not tested this semester, mostly because of the logistics of it, but I will be testing it, because with a large class, it's a little bit difficult to engage, to create those things. And also because, as I told you, it is very important that the instructor participates and the instructor can give feedback and the like. And of course, my concern is, what if they set up a time where I am teaching, or where I cannot log in, right? So that is one of the reasons why I've been kind of skeptical towards this. This works, of course, very well if you have TAs who can, work and join your class. Of course, I would imagine that that's not the case of almost any of you. But that is also a possibility. Of course, another possibility is that you set up a few times already where you know that you will be there, right? And that you will set up the breakout rooms only at those times. Again, is one possibility. Again, the students perform better, as you can see here in the syllabus. And in addition to performing it better, they also reported that they preferred it to regular online delivery of materials. Another way that this is done, and this is what I've been exploring this semester, has to do with using the discussion board as the Interteach. Instead of them meeting face to face, if you want to put it this way, the way this works. And again, this is, I am testing for the first time this semester, so I still don't have solid data to show you this, or I cannot compare these to others. But this is how it works in at least one of my courses. This is an online asynchronous course, so my students don't meet face to face. So the way this works is, essentially, I have the discussion guide. This is what shows up in their syllabus. So generally, by Wednesdays at 7, they have to submit their answers to a prep guide, and then they have to copy and paste those questions to their discussion boards. The discussion boards are divided, are split into little groups. So each group has about 4 or 5 students, and they all see each other's responses. And then instead of having, the usual prompts in the discussion questions, what they discuss in the discussion board is their answers. I ask them to come up with examples, comment critically, go beyond the usual yes or no, or that was good, as you would do with other discussion questions. Because this is done in the discussion boards, instead of using the 10 or 12 questions as is typical of Interteach, I just have 4 or 5 questions, generally 5. Of course, larger questions, but very and more complex questions, right? Not you don't have many of those just basic. What is the definition of so and so? But that means that the amount of material that they have to answer, the prep guides are not as extensive. In any case, so they have to submit them to their discussion board by Wednesdays, and they can work answering each other's, replying to each other's by Saturday. So that gives them at least about 3 days to complete this. And at that point, they resubmit their prep guides. This is also a modification from the traditional one. And when they resubmit their prep guides, what I want them is to add any material that they have learned in the discussion, anything new that they learned, any changes in their answers, any examples, any comments. So when they resubmit on Sunday, they have to provide proof that they did learn something in the discussion. And the way they do it is I ask them to type any changes that they do in red. That way I can go back and check the previous submission and the new one to see if their answers are okay, if they are good, but also what they learned, if they learned. And I also reward them by giving some points for the revision, for the change that they demonstrate. And then, of course, at the end of the week, they submit their discussion record, the log, where they talk and describe what is going on and what is working with their session, and so on. So far, I probably should have showed you at least a snippet of this. Most of my students seem to enjoy this, at least more so than regular discussions, mostly because they are not as vague, and they already have their material, so it is easier to discuss and comment on each other. So it provides at least some advantage over this. Of course, the idea here is also that you as the instructor are able to jump in the conversation and discuss this a little bit. This is the part that has been giving me a little bit of trouble. And again, this is probably because this is the first time that I have used this approach in an asynchronous class. And again, this is an issue that we often have when dealing with discussion questions, and it is at which point do you jump, right? And when do you want to participate? When do you want them to talk a lot, and so on and so on? For instance, one of the problems that I've had occur when the students only put their answers to their peers' questions very late, very close to the deadline, which doesn't allow a lot of exchange. So these are things that I will be tweaking, of course, in future versions of the class and probably in this class. But nonetheless, at least for now, my students seem to be enjoying the discussion questions. It provides kind of a different approach to doing the discussion questions, and it also increases their engagement with each other. So at least in that respect, it seems to be a very interesting strategy. So this is what I have for now. As I said, I wanted to, because we're kind of running out of time, I wanted to show you before I stop this one video that I made to one of my classes. And here you can see one of my modules and how I have a prep guide here on Canvas. As you can see, about 12 questions. This is for a regular hybrid class. So the way this works in my classes this semester are only Tuesday, Thursdays. So I have a group each time. I split my class into groups. And this is the prep guide. This is due Mondays by 7. And of course, they complete it. And you can see the rubric emphasizes just submission, the first submission, just submitting this. And then, of course, they have their meeting. And then after their class meeting, which is synchronous, of course. For those who are taking the class only online, they do it in Zoom, but they also do it like person to person. I generally put a computer, one of the students in the classroom with a computer, such that the people on online can participate. And in any case, just like with the other class, right, by the end of the week, they need to resubmit with any changes in red font. And then I add a mini lecture. For instance, I have one here, one example of those. So it is a mini lecture on that topic. This is for a hybrid online class. And as I said, at the end of the class, I generally share end of the session record. This is what the end of the record form does. As you can see, this is a Google Docs link that I sent during class. It also allows me to keep track of attendance, of course, right? So I ask them, who was your partner during the session? How did you rate your session? What contributed to the quality? This is based on the original format, but you can modify this as you see fit. How prepared were you for this session? How prepared do you think your classmates were for this session? Notice that this is optional, right? Topics that gave you difficulty. What was difficult? What topics would they like them to cover in the mini lecture? What they find more interesting? What questions should be omitted or reviewed? Other comments or suggestions, and let me show you some of their answers. This is noted that this was just a couple of weeks ago, right? So you can tell, right? Many of my students, most of my students rated it very highly. There's a couple who didn't like it very much, although of course sometimes they don't say that. Notice aspects that they liked about this. It was good. We didn't really have any different answers. Talking about our various opinions for the answers of the reading guide, also asking questions that needed clarification helped. My partner gave insight on things I was not clear of. They were nice and communicated well. Notice also that most of them suggest that they are very well prepared and some others not so much. Here, probably we see the couple who had a very bad session, right? Here, they mentioned some of the topics that they would like to be clarified, right? That were difficult. Notice that their feedback is not extensive. Generally, it used to be a little bit more extensive when I collected this on paper, because of course the students have to type on their phones and the like. But in general, you can see at least some aspects that they find interesting, useful. They comment on what they found more interesting, what type of questions they didn't like. Notice that in general, sometimes there is a question or so that a lot of people don't like, so that also allows you in future versions of the class to change this. Notice that a few students say great class and those type of things. So these are some of the type of things that you will find with your students. So I don't know how we're doing on time. Maybe we should leave.
We've run over by a few minutes. I want to allow an opportunity for anybody to ask a question. Does anybody have any last questions to ask?
So have you done this with freshmen, and how did that go?
Oh, fantastic. These that I just showed you are freshmen. Well, not all of them, but this is an intro 101 class. So most of these are freshmen, and they love it. They actually love it, right?
Okay.
Yeah. I think one good thing about this is that you can engage at different levels, right? So with the more freshman classes, you can go for the more general, not as in-depth topics. With more advanced class, you can go deep in, right? So it is very flexible. It really is up to you ultimately and how good your questions are. Mm-hmm.
So adjust. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Being flexible is the goal. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks you.
Andres, thank you very much. This was very informative. I really appreciate your giving this presentation.
Well, I'm more than happy to do it. Of course, if you do it, please let me know, because I would like to know more about other people using it here. So please do.